Take its time through the morning, but it will eventually push back towards the east. And although it seems unfair to have the same repeating weather pattern if you're in the east, I'm afraid we've got a few more days of it. A lot of low cloud remaining here and suppressed temperatures. Humidity rises on Thursday and Friday. Higher temperatures, but a risk of showers as well.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. An explosive report in the Daily Telegraph citing a new study challenging the efficacy of COVID-19 lockdowns. It claims a tiny number of deaths were saved by stay-at-home measures. I'll be speaking to one of the authors of this study, as well as addressing the latest on the COVID inquiry. Migration Nation. The Prime Minister delivered a flagship speech today, insisting his plan to stop small boats crossing is starting to work. But with critics accusing Rishi Sunak of cynical spin over the issue, could the government just ignore the European Court's blockage of the Rwanda plan? I'll be speaking to former Justice Minister and barrister Lord Wolfson. Green or mean? With warnings from MPs and business experts about the potential of a net zero grocery tax, pushing up food bills by up to £4 billion, and Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's own natural ally, the GMB, slamming his plans to end offshore drilling, it's been an eventful few days in the eco-universe. My sagacious panel will examine this. Speculation is swirling over whether the Ukrainian military has launched a counteroffensive in the South Donetsk region after Russia claims to have thwarted a major assault in eastern Ukraine. I'll be joined by Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko for the latest on this development from the conflict. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by an especially feisty panel today. Two of the country's brainiest historians and writers, the pugnacious Dr. David Starkey and the effervescent Dr. Tessa Dunlop. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But first of all, it's time for the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. The top story tonight, the Prime Minister says his plan to tackle the arrival of illegal migrants to the UK in small boats and the asylum backlog is starting to work, but he admits there's still a long way to go. During a speech in Kent, the Prime Minister said small boat crossings were down 20%. Rishi Sunak also announced a further 2 barges to accommodate a further 1,000 migrants, but wouldn't comment on where they'd be located. The Prime Minister says the government's using every tool at its disposal to tackle illegal migration. But the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has welcomed the news, saying the government needs to secure more return agreements with other countries.
I think everybody wants to make sure that we stop the boats. We don't want people making that dangerous journey. All we've really had from the government, though, is the announcement of a policy that doesn't work, then the re-announcement of the same policy, essentially. And it often feels, I think, like Groundhog Day. And meanwhile, that's costing a fortune for the taxpayer. And there's this growing sense of frustration. I mean, I'm at Hinkley Point C here today. Fantastic project. It's behind schedule, and there's a frustration here.
Sir Keir Starmer. Now, the Metropolitan Police says Conservative MP Bob Stewart has been charged with 2 public order offences alleged to have happened in December last year. Scotland Yard said the 73-year-old had been charged with a racially aggravated offence after an incident in central London last year. The force has said he'll appear at Westminster Magistrates Court on July the 5th. The Foreign Secretaries held talks with President Zelensky in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Ukraine's president has thanked the UK for their continued support amid the country's counter-offensive to the Russian invasion. The pair discussed Ukraine's possible membership with NATO after Rishi Sunak supported Ukraine joining the organisation last week. And here at home, Holly Willoughby has returned to the daytime television show this morning for the first time, following co-presenter Philip Schofield's exit last week. Opening the show alongside new This Morning presenter Josie Gibson, Miss Willoughby said she felt shaken, troubled and let down by Philip Schofield after he'd admitted to an affair with a younger male work colleague. And in happier news, Princess Eugenie has announced the birth of her second child. It's a boy named Ernest George Ronnie Brooksbank. She posted a photograph on her Instagram account earlier on today, saying Ernest was born on the 30th of May. And Princess Eugenie says her son August, her first son that is already loving being a big brother. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on the TuneIn app. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
The Daily Telegraph exclusively reported this morning that the first lockdown measures only saved around 1,700 lives. Scientists from Johns Hopkins University say lockdowns had negligible impact compared to the colossal collateral effect on young people, education and the economy. A, quote, policy failure of gigantic proportions, a drop in the bucket compared to the staggering collateral costs imposed. This is really serious because lockdown seemed to have been accepted and popular, but they were in fact based on Professor Neil Ferguson's hysterical modelling forecasting that 500,000 lives would be lost without action. And we now know that those models weren't right. If you look at comparisons between harsh lockdowns and the more voluntary methods, such as Sweden used, there's only a small mortality difference of about 3.2%. With business closures that were associated with actually a 7.5% fall in mortality, balanced by gathering limits linked to a 5.9% increase in death rates. So although they squeezed the balloon in one area, the balloon expanded in other areas, which meant that the overall effect wasn't that successful. And the Telegraph report, not only this, but that the COVID disinformation unit monitored social media and asked companies to remove posts it considered to be potentially harmful content. Now, why is this important? Because if you wanted to put the counter-argument, if you put it on Facebook or you put it on Twitter, or even if you wrote about it in newspapers, the government was trying to stop you. And I was a minister in the government at the time, and I certainly didn't know that this sort of thing was going on, because one of the best ways in a democracy to stop bad policy making is freedom of speech, so that people can stand up and say this is a bad policy. But that was being deliberately squeezed out of the system by, to my mind, improper use of governmental power. As we know, Boris Johnson, when he agreed to the lockdown, said he did so with a heavy heart and that no Prime Minister would want to do it, but it was thought to be essential to save thousands of lives. Now, the government claims that it's going to learn from the COVID inquiry's findings, which will play a key role in informing planning and preparations for the future. The problem is, we've already seen the growing power of groupthink in the blob, which hasn't yet been challenged. And that's a key issue, because the inquiry will only have sensible answers if it challenges what was done before. Unfortunately, if you look at the 150 questions that it sent to Boris Johnson, some of which are purely gossipy, I'm fascinating, but just gossip, if the inquiry goes down the route of those questions, not just the gossipy ones, it looks as if it's concerned that lockdown wasn't harsh enough, not whether or not lockdown was right in the first place. And so that's what we need to be thinking about, not whether Boris talked about injecting himself with COVID in the early days. All that's completely irrelevant. It's about, was the lockdown right? And if the inquiry goes down the route of endless gossipy emails and text messages and WhatsApp messages and trying to prove that it should have been a harsher lockdown, the question will be, is Lady Hallett wasting everybody's time? But of course, I want to know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm now delighted to say I'm joined by one of the authors of the study, Special Advisor at the Centre for Political Studies based in Denmark, Jonas Herby. Jonas, thank you so much for joining me. Can you just give me a brief overview of why you've come to these conclusions and how statistically robust you think they are?
Yeah, I would like to. So I think the notion that lockdowns are very effective is based on some early studies that didn't account for people's voluntary behavior changes. So when a pandemic hit a country, people, if they're informed about the risk and how to protect themselves, they will react accordingly. So that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic that people canceled birthday parties, we worked from home if possible, we kept social distancing and so on. So when governments lock down, it's on top of all these voluntary behavior changes. So the choice was never between business as usual and lockdowns. It was between voluntary behavior changes and lockdown. And when you look at studies that take this into account, that people change behavior, then the effect of lockdowns turns out to be very limited.
And that's really important, because we knew very early on that there were high-risk categories and that people in those categories could voluntarily lock themselves down quite strictly, whereas children who turned out to be at no risk at all stopped their education, to my mind, quite unnecessarily with the evidence that we now have.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. It's there's a lot of evidence that shows that, first of all, everybody reacted to the pandemic, but especially elderly people and people who are vulnerable reacted. There's a study comparing spending in Denmark and Sweden. And Sweden didn't lock down, but you still saw almost the same drop in consumer spending in Sweden, because people were more careful. And that was especially among the elderly that the spending dropped.
And we saw that in the UK when in Christmas 2021, the UK government, His Majesty's government, decided not to impose a lockdown on England, but the Welsh government decided to have a lockdown in Wales, and yet the death rate in Wales was worse than that in England. So the voluntary activities in England were more successful than the compulsory efforts in Wales.
Yeah, and it's not really any magical thing, because you all the time in the society, if you're driving on a highway and it starts snowing, then people reduce the speed and are more careful. And it's more or less the exact same thing that happens when it's a pandemic. It's two different methods, but it increases the risk of our daily activities. And then people, when they're informed and when they know the risk and how to protect themselves, they adjust their behavior. It's very straightforward when you think about it. So the question here is, can government, by locking down, save even more lives? And our study, which is based on 22 studies that look into this, shows that yes, the governments can affect the number of lives, but it's a very small effect compared to the large cost.
And it may possibly be even smaller than you're suggesting, because interestingly, one of the things you think was most effective was the use of masks, but I've read of other studies that show that masks were completely ineffective. And if you take masks out, then the effect is even lower than the 1,700 deaths saved that you've predicted.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we find a relatively large effect of masks compared to the other what we were promised by the Imperial College studies that you referred to. Then the effect is very small, no matter what estimate you use. But I did see from the Cochrane review, and they used different what's called randomized controlled trials. So their study is stronger than our study. So I think there's a discussion there on how it works. So yeah, I agree on that. But I think the main point here is that no matter how we work out these data, they all show that the effect is very small if you take into account that people adjust their behavior when there's a pandemic in the country.
And isn't this the fundamental point, that with any modelling, it can't take account for the random changes in human behaviour, and that this is a fundamental weakness of all modelling of human behaviour, because it assumes that other things will be equal. And the whole point is that when there is a pandemic or any other crisis, other things aren't equal. They fundamentally change and people adjust, and people should in fact be trusted to make those adjustments rather than thinking that Big Brother knows best.
I think it's wrong to say that models can't take this into account, but the models that you probably referred to from Imperial College didn't take that into account. They did actually note it in the study, but it was never reflected in the media coverage of that study at the time. So I think, yeah, models can do that, but they didn't in the beginning of the pandemic. And even if you use a model that can, it's very difficult to forecast how people will respond to the pandemic. The only thing we know is that people will respond, and they'll also respond to low case numbers. So let's just assume that the lockdown works to begin with. Then when case numbers go down, then people will see that, okay, now it's safe to meet with friends, and they will start meeting again, and then case numbers will go up. So it's kind of what's called like an equilibrium where you have a certain case number, and yeah, behavior is very important, I think, is the point.
Thank you so much. I think your study is a really important contribution to the debate. But we've got more important contributions to the debate coming up from Dr. David Starkey and Dr. Tessa Dunlop. Tessa, do we now know that lockdown is a complete waste of time and we should just let people make decisions for themselves? Trust the people.
I was fascinated that you referred to lockdown as popular. I wasn't aware that anybody, I mean, obviously the odd sort of deeply in love couple who thought that they lived in this bucolic haven of Wiltshire liked being stuck with their children, but for the vast majority of us, it was a repugnant experience. However,
it polled very well.
Well, because people felt that finally the government had, pitched their shoulder to the wheel and recognised there was a pandemic in the air. But what's interesting, you're a perspicacious individual. Some would say you're almost overeducated, and yet you cite this as a wonderful and fascinating study. It's not been peer-reviewed, and actually it's been funded by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is little more than a lobby group. And so I don't think in terms...
like the Roundtree Foundation and similar groups.
But you can't then tout it as, you get on an academic from Denmark and he looks frightfully serious and we all believe what he says.
He is frightfully serious.
Well, he is indeed. But I'm just suggesting that his research isn't foolproof.
But is the
not
meta study?
Can we just
well,
yes, but can we just say two things? There is a great deal of evidence that the person on whose work this was founded is beyond belief flawed. I don't mean this particular report. I mean the basis of lockdown. That is Neil Ferguson at Imperial College. We have abundant historical evidence, that's to say, he was utterly wrong about BSE, again, by factors of hundreds.
Well, we should all be dying of BSE by now.
If not literally hundreds, if not thousands. He was completely wrong about foot and mouth. It is perfectly clear that he was wrong about this. We've also, again, we were fighting statistics with statistics. We are both historians. I would actually like to look at why we locked down.
We locked down because of government's failure to act in time.
Nonsense.
Yes, no proper planning. This is going back years, David, not nonsense.
Tessa, you were simply blethering. Can I actually give you the facts? The facts are very clear. It all happens on a single weekend, the 12th, 13th and 14th of March. I will tell you precisely what happened. The first was the extraordinary figures that came out of Ferguson. The second were the photographs of Italy, which showed people piling up in wards because they were being mistreated. We now know, of course, that intubating and putting people
was a mistake.
Was a complete mistake and more or less guaranteed to kill them. I mean, Boris Johnson had a very, very narrow
He's very lucky to avoid. I'm going to give Tessa a moment to come back.
No, please, because there's a final key point, which is that the Daily Mail got the Mail on Sunday, got photographs of the West London hospital, which showed similar scenes in corridors. In other words, what we had...
Let's have a quick response.
We all know that you're talking about the 12th of March, decisions that had been made. Boris Johnson hadn't been at a Cobra meeting before the 2nd of March. Actually, if you look at who, they recognise the mistakes they made.
You're blithering.
You have to plan for a pandemic and then you don't need to lock down.
Absolutely brilliant. We've got more coming up from the panel. They are a force of nature when they're discussing with each other. I always want to hear your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. But coming up, Rishi Sunak delivered a speech this morning lauding his government's progress, His Majesty's government's progress, on stemming small boat crossings over the English Channel. Could the government just ignore the European Court blockage of the Rwanda plan? I'll be speaking to former Justice Minister and barrister Lord Wolfson.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Helena says, we should be able to do rather better evaluating how many lives could have been saved if hospitals had prevented transmission and also not discharged positive cases to care homes. Well, Trevor says there's a lot of talk about the government imposing lockdowns and the result of these, but I don't hear anyone talking about the scientists who gave the government the so-called advice. What repercussions for these so-called experts? They should all be sacked. I think that's harsh because they gave their advice in good faith, even if their advice turned out not always to be right. Robert says every nation presents a unique context, so comparable data relating to lockdowns are meaningless. The only way to reach real comparisons would be to run it again and not lockdown. Well, I hope we don't have to run it again. That might prove awkward. The Prime Minister made a speech today updating the nation on His Majesty's government's efforts to stem the illegal crossing of small boats. Mr Sunak said the numbers making the journey across the Channel were down by around a fifth since last year, but acknowledged that the government has a long way still to go. Critics have hit back at the Prime Minister's lauding of his own work, calling the speech cynical spin for failing to acknowledge factors such as the weather conditions, which the Bank of England, I think, thought caused inflation, for influencing the number of illegal crossings. Let's hear what he had to say.
The plan is starting to work. But in the 5 months since I launched the plan, crossings are now down 20% compared to last year. That's right, crossings are down 20%. And in December, I reached a deal with Albania. We've now returned 1,800 to Albania in just 6 months. Well, so far this year, the number of Albanian small boat arrivals has fallen by almost 90%.
I'm not sure I gave the tie-list look, but there we are. I'm perhaps a little old-fashioned. However, the constitutional settlement of Britain within the ECHR has also been raised as a factor in the feasibility of the government's aims. Former Justice Minister Lord Wolfson wrote in the Daily Telegraph today that the government should not consider itself bound by Rule 39, a de facto injunction given by Strasbourg against the UK. Well, I'm absolutely delighted that the man himself, Lord Wolfson, has kindly come in to talk about that. So, with Rule 39, an unnamed, anonymous judge, we now know not a Russian, but at one point rumoured to be a Russian, was awoken or disturbed from an evening out and said you can't send aeroplanes to Rwanda, even though the British High Court had said that you can, on condition that if we find against you, you would then bring them back. Was that a reasonable thing to do, and could the government just have overruled it?
Well, you actually understate the position, because it's not just the British High Court which had refused to give an injunction. That had been upheld in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. So the British government had actually won 3 times. The European Court of Human Rights, an unnamed judge, then gave, as you say, a Rule 39 injunction, effectively. And the real question is, do we have to abide by them? When we signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights, we signed up to a number of obligations. One of those obligations is that we have to enforce and abide by final rulings or final judgments given by the court against the UK. Clearly, an interim injunction such as this isn't a final judgment. More than that, when the convention was being drafted in the late 40s, one of the drafts of the convention gave the court the power to give these interim injunctions. That didn't find its way into the final version of the convention. So there is no basis in the convention itself for this power. And as I and others have argued, the court cannot arrogate to itself a jurisdiction which it wasn't given by the member states.
But it has, and we followed it, even though some other countries don't. So If you had been Attorney General at the time, would you have advised the government simply to proceed and send those planes to Rwanda?
Well, we can follow injunctions on the basis that the court has jurisdiction to give them, or we could actually follow them while reserving our position on the jurisdictional issue. So there are two issues, aren't there? There's a legal issue and a political issue. Whether one actually wants to follow the injunction raises both of those issues. If I'd have been Attorney General, the one thing I would have done was to put down a clear marker that although the practice of this country has been, in fact, to abide by Rule 39 injunctions, that's not because we have a treaty obligation to do so. We don't.
And the political argument then becomes paramount.
Yes.
You're a politician as well as a lawyer. As a politician, do you think the government would have been wise, with all the pressure that there was a year ago on the small boats coming over, the expectation, as has turned out to be the case, that it would continue, politically to say, actually, we don't accept this, our own courts have judged that it's fair, we will of course abide by a final decision whilst we're within the treaty, but in the meantime, the planes are going off?
I'm not sure politically, really, whether it would have made that much of a difference in the long run, because we have the Rwanda policy wending its way through our courts at the moment. The government succeeded at first instance before the divisional court, as you know. That's now going on appeal. I'm not sure at the end of the day it would have made a difference to the policy. We would still be tied up in the legal arguments which we are now currently engaged in. The critical thing is that nobody should be able to think that we regard ourselves as having an obligation to abide by Rule 39 orders.
And you have hot-footed it today from the House of Lords, which is debating this very subject. The House of Lords is very against the power being reserved to the Home Secretary, or the Secretary of State, technically, to override Rule 39 orders. How are you going to persuade the House of Lords not to obstruct the government in this confirmatory piece of legislation?
Well, one hopes the House of Lords will always listen to reasoned argument, and I and others are trying to set out the argument.
Is that the triumph of hope over experience?
Well, I did win some debates when I was a minister, although I lost a number as well. So the debate, the qualitative debate in the House of Lords actually is very good. I think you're right. The weight of the numbers in the Lords at the moment are certainly against various provisions in the bill. However, the House of Lords has a strong history of recognising that ultimately it is has to play second fiddle to the elected chamber. And I think that's part of our constitutional settlement. The House of Lords is a revising chamber. It can ask the Commons to think again. I'm sure it will ask the Commons to think again. But if the Commons, having thought again, says, actually, this is what we want to do, I would hope that at some point the House of Lords recognises that there are some battles it shouldn't win.
But do you think the Rule 39 order is symptomatic of how the ECHR is trying to take more powers to itself and is at the heart of the discontent within the UK, where we've got a very well-established legal system, we have the rule of law, the discontent that we feel with membership of the Convention and abiding by the court, and that if the court doesn't work this out, actually in a few years' time the UK will leave the auspices of the Convention?
Well, law has a zeitgeist. Law ebbs and flows. And the interesting thing is that there were a number of decisions of the European Court of Human Rights which held that it did not have the power to give these orders. Then it changed tack and held that it did have the power. The British government is now engaged with the Strasbourg Court in a very meaningful way. Robert Jenrick has given a number of interviews on this. And I would expect that the Strasbourg Court will not want to take on, so to speak, one of the main member states on an issue like this. The Strasbourg Court has, to be fair to it, moved in the last few years to a position of subsidiarity, recognising that member states ought to have a greater freedom to adopt policies which are suitable for their own societies. And I suspect that's where we will end up on this issue.
And the court is much more political than you might expect a court to be. Actually, in a way, all courts are. They're part of the political nation, or in this case, the political international settlement. And if you look at the ruling on prisoner voting rights, which the UK refused to implement, eventually the court accepted and the council accepted a compromise that basically meant almost nobody got voting rights who was in prison.
And of course we accepted the compromise as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
yes.
that was it's a very good example actually of where there's a bit of a standoff. But I think both sides, if I can put it that way, recognise that really there has to be a solution. The court won't want the UK to leave. I think for us to leave the European Convention of Human Rights would be a retrograde step. I find it difficult to believe, really, that we can't run our society and stay a member of the Convention. And therefore, at the end of the day, I think a solution will be found.
Do you fundamentally believe that human rights in this country need to be protected by an international convention or are best protected by domestic elections?
Well, I think there are certain things where the issue is best settled by a democratic vote. And you could make a case, for example, I think Lord Wolfson makes this case. Why do we not have a big political issue in this country on abortion, whereas they do, for example, in the States? And Lord Wolfson's approach is to say, well, in the States, it's a judicial decision at the end of the day. People feel, therefore, disenfranchised. In our country, it's a free vote in the House of Commons. So some things, I think, are best left to Parliament rather than to courts. And assisted dying is another example, I think.
But if life isn't a fundamental right established by the courts, but is best set by democracy, what is a fundamental right?
Well, it is an oddity. I mean, this is a big philosophical issue. It is something of an oddity that, for example, under the Convention, the right to life is a qualified right, i.e. there are circumstances in which one can take away life. Torture is unqualified. Even if it doesn't lead to death. So one can have a very interesting philosophical debate on points like this. I mean, I think we come from a strong common law tradition. I'm a huge fan of the common law. The common law is a system of law which suits us in these islands and has stood the test of time. It is fair to say, however, that there are some rights which we now recognise as important, which actually did come from the Strasbourg jurisprudence. So left to ourselves, perhaps we wouldn't have got there or wouldn't have got there as quickly. What I really want to see is to make sure that we can graft on the Convention jurisprudence onto our common law.
Well, David, thank you very much. We are so lucky to have had Lord Wolfson on, and you can see how interesting the discussion has been. But I want your thoughts as well. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, what a week it's been for the drive to meet net zero. From reducing domestic oil supplies, socialist policy, to an increase in gas boiler prices, Tory policy, and now talk of a grocery tax, Tory policy, which could send food bills soaring, combined with the Saudis seeking to boost prices by cutting supply by 1 million barrels of oil a day. With the impact of net zero finally about to bite, what will be the effect on the British people? My feisty panel unpick the latest on the green agenda. All this to come on State of the Nation.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Friday on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Carter says, what planet is Rishi living on? As soon as the weather changes in the Channel, they'll be coming in droves. But Harris counters that. He's keen on legal immigrants. We thrive on legal immigrants. We should encourage any immigrant who is productive to the country. And Graham says the only way to solve this is to leave the ECHR, get rid of the civil servants who are deliberately holding things up, and start deporting illegal immigrants straight away. But now we're going to be talking about the merry news on net zero. Senior Conservatives have warned that the net zero green levies will push shopping bills up by £4 billion a year, which would increase household shopping bills by £140 annually. In a scheme that's going to be rolled out in April next year, retailers and manufacturers will be charged for the cost to councils for recycling packaging. Labour then wants to cancel our North Sea supplies, which would merely encourage Russia and other oil-producing states who have said they will cut supply to push up prices. Remember, supply and demand, fueling further concerning news on rising costs. OPEC Plus has decided to extend its production cuts, so the world's biggest oil producers have agreed to a prospective cut in production next year because they're worried prices aren't high enough. May not be what you at home think, but finally some sense, as one of Sir Keir Starmer's top union backers has savaged his plans to end offshore drilling, branding Starmer as both naive and wrong. This is from a socialist, bear in mind, it's not from me. The General Secretary of the GMB union called on the party to stop putting what was popular ahead of what was right for the country. Well, let's get the views of my eclectic panel of Dr. David Starkey and Dr. Tessa Dunlop. Tessa, ultimately people won't vote to be cold and poor, will they?
No, they won't, and it's a shame that the Conservative government has done so little to ensure that they are neither cold nor poor. You confirmed when we were having a little off-air chit-chat that you're not a climate denier. You recognise that the planet's in dire straits if we carry on going forward in the way we are. And also all the science suggests that if we got up and running, and Britain is so well positioned to not just engage with renewables, but actually be the world leader because we are an island, our bills would be reduced by over £100 a month by 2030. So I can see no reason why you can tinker at the edges and say, oh, whoopsie, a little green tax or too much packaging will cost us. But actually, we know that if we take control of this, we can own it. And storage, for instance, the technology around storing new energy, we could sell.
But it's all
technology.
extra costs. It's £140 on groceries. It's £180 or something for the hydrogen levy. It's £300 for a more expensive
but Jacob,
boiler.
As a keen
it's
Brexiteer,
extremely high costs on people when prices are rising.
And as a keen Brexiteer, I have heard you say, yes, there are initial costs to Brexit. Indeed, it's been worked out at £250.
No, I haven't said anything of the kind. We've saved £191 billion by not being part of the mad COVID recovery
It's now being touted as costing households as $250 each. But Brexiteers tell us to take that on the chin because it will get better.
I've never said that. It's only the ABR who's wrong on everything. I don't know why you think they're right on Brexit. David, do you think people will vote to be cold and poor?
No, of course they won't, and they're already showing that they won't. I think what's striking is the parallels between this and COVID. You have a particular kind of deliberately generated panic. That's the first thing. Secondly, you have a single issue committee, the extraordinary role of the Climate Change Committee fronted by the Lord Debden, of course, who will remember was heavily involved in BSE. And a rather interesting whiff of corruption is a very strong word that was mentioned in the Sunday Times with the extraordinary interests of those who are keen on climate change and stopping climate change. There's very strong, just one second, very strong interest in the various technologies. Now,
but I think he's made all the declarations required by the House of Lords.
Apparently not.
Well, that's a matter of the House of Lords committee. But
indeed it is. But I think we need to be asking really fundamental questions, which we're not. You see, it's very interesting what Tessa is saying. This myth that there is a thing called a green economy. Now, and that this apparently will just one second, that this will all see us marvellously and mysteriously better off. Because, of course, the historical facts are rather simple. Always cheaper fuel has been the thing that's driven industrial innovation, social innovation, the fact that we enjoy the staggering degrees of wealth we do now. We are the first peoples to decide deliberately to do the opposite. And I think, you need to be giving, and forgive my pointing, but you need to be putting the arguments and you need to be giving us the evidence. Why doing exactly the opposite that all sensible people have done since the 18th century is mysteriously going to benefit us? Why?
If I could explain, because actually what we're doing and how we are behaving as humankind is no longer sustainable. As a Conservative, because we're going to have severe food security issues. We've had unprecedented drought. The one
Nonsense.
thing... Wait a minute, David, you can't ask me why and then not let me reply. The one thing that unites me with my Moldovan mother-in-law, and she's been on this planet working the soil for 70 years, is how the hell do you grow stuff if it doesn't rain? And in Scotland last week, the country I was born in, 2 seconds,
you're not answering the question.
The biggest forest fires in Britain, and it hardly made their headlines. So I want to know, if you don't want to adapt the way we're living, and by the way, if you don't want mass migration from continents like Africa, we need to lean into green. I want to know what you're going to do about it, David.
You use an interesting word. You used the word adapt. Suddenly, you stopped talking about panic, necessity.
I never talked about panic.
On the contrary, you did. You were talking about unprecedented. You were using the language of warfare. You were using the language of extremity, which is exactly what got us in the mess with COVID. What we need is sensible, rather cautious, rather incremental policies. Instead, we're seeing extraordinary... We will suddenly decide we are going to cut gas production from the North Sea. We're suddenly going to ban all forms of energy other than heat exchange, heat pumps, which, of course, wildly problematic. In other words, it's panic.
David,
It's a refusal to think.
Tessa, adaptation is surely the right word,
Yes.
because you talk about water. If you look at irrigation in Israel, the amount of water it uses is incredibly productive. If you look at irrigation in India, it's enormously wasteful of water. If India were to use the irrigation policies used in Israel, there would be no shortage. So adaptation is perfectly feasible.
But the problem is, and that's a very good example, where you have very well-off, tiny Israel. I mean, it's scarcely bigger than North Perthshire.
No, but this is the development of agriculture over the last 200 years, that it starts in one country, and then it...
In other words,
Tessa,
all Jacob is gently trying to point out to you is that if we get more prosperous, on the whole, we run the planet better.
But do you know what?
Just one second.
We don't get to choose the timescale for that 1.5
Stop
degrees
shouting.
that matters. No, but I have to, so
you
I get a
are
word
shouting. Just listen to calm. The evidence is overwhelmingly clear that if we trust the extraordinary forces of capitalism, capitalism will solve this problem. Of course you do, because you believe in panic. You believe in state regulation.
I want to give Tessa a very final word.
I'm the daughter of a farmer. You're an indoor man. You're an archive man. I'm telling you, out there, it is.
You mean to say I understand sources and you don't? That is extremely clear.
It's extremely clear. You work the soil, food production, then water security, and then guess what? Mass migration. Stop the boats. Then I ask.
I think we'll barge into Dan Wootton's show if we continue. But thank you to my panel for that. After the break, I will be joined by Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine amid speculation that a much-anticipated counteroffensive could be in its early stages.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Daryl says, all these plans will do is cost ordinary people lots of money and make a few people very rich. We are all being conned on an astronomical level. Says, how many MPs have an interest in these green initiatives that are pushing so hard for this? And John, a money-making scam to produce many more billionaires worldwide. Now, over the weekend, there has been much conjecture on whether a long-awaited counter-offensive by Kyiv has begun. On Sunday evening, the Russian defence minister claimed a large-scale offensive had been thwarted in 5 sectors on the front line in the South Donetsk region. The Defence Ministry claimed it had warded off attacks by 6 mechanised battalions and 2 tank battalions in the southeastern region, alleging that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers had lost their lives. While it's been predicted that this could be one of the fronts where Ukraine may begin its push forward, in line with the previous media blackout during past offensive, there has been no comment from Ukraine on this action until today, when Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister said in some areas Kyiv's forces are moving to offensive actions. She claimed that in the south Russia is on the defensive and actively releasing information of a repelled counteroffensive because they need to divert attention from their defeat in the Bakhmut direction. Some Russian sources, however, have denied the claims being put out by the Russian ministry, saying it's fake news. The Ukrainian military suggested there would be no public promotion to accompany any such offensive operation, releasing a video entitled Plans Like Silence, and Ukraine's defence minister posted a tweet quoting the Depeche Mode track Enjoy the Silence with the message, words are very unnecessary, they can only do harm. This is rather similar to posters we put up during World War II saying careless talk costs lives. Over the weekend, President Zelensky said Ukraine was ready with 9 assault brigades assembled and F-6 fighter jets on the horizon once Ukrainian pilots had received training. Meeting today in Kiev with the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, he said the pair discussed issues including Ukraine's expectations from the NATO summit in Vilnius. He also said important agreements have been reached in recent weeks. I'm very pleased and honoured that joining me to discuss the latest on this is Oleksiy Goncharenko, a member of Parliament in Ukraine and a member of the Ukrainian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Oleksiy, thank you so much for joining me this evening. What can you tell me about what's happening at the moment?
There is the fog of the war. It's quite hard to say exactly what's happening, but definitely Ukrainian forces in some parts of the front line are in offensive activities, and we have some successes, but it's quite hard to estimate the scale of offensive and the scale of successes for the moment. It looks like Ukrainian army now is actively looking for weak spots in Russian defense. And when these weak spots will be found, then a really full-scale activities will start in order to use these weak spots in order to break the Russian defensive lines.
And how much more do you feel the West ought to be doing, that NATO ought to be doing to support you in terms of ammunition and training?
We're very thankful for all support we are receiving, and special thanks to the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, when Prime Minister was Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, today Rishi Sunak, all time show leadership, and that is very important for us. Many times the United Kingdom was the first country to make some very important steps, like, for example, providing Ukraine with tanks or with the long-range missiles. So that is very important for us. But definitely we need more. We are against the big army, and Russia was preparing for the war for years. Yes, they are not so good as they claimed to themselves to be, but still they're numerous. They have a lot of weapon, a lot of iron. Maybe this is not the up-to-date weaponry, but it is massive from Soviet times also. So we definitely need fighter jets because it's quite hard to attack without air force. We definitely need more ammunition, and we definitely need more long-range missiles, because for the moment only the United Kingdom provides us with the long-range missiles, and that is crucial for all our military plans.
Thank you. And one final question, and I hope, if you don't mind, a brief answer. Russia inevitably has said that they've pushed back, but one can't really believe a word that's coming from the Russian propaganda machine, can one?
Absolutely. I just want to remind you, when Russian flagman ship Moskva was a missile cruiser, was already submarine on the bottom of the Black Sea, Russia was still saying that it is somewhere on the top, moving somewhere. So they're lying all the time. Don't follow them and don't listen to Russian propaganda at all.
Well, Oleksiy, thank you so much for joining me, and we wish you every success in any operation that is being carried out. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Dan Wootton. What scandals do you have in store tonight, Professor? Did Holly turn out to be a bit prickly?
Well, do you know what? There's only one person who the nation wants to hear from on this, Jacob, and it is Kim Woodburn. She's back to give her verdict on that Holly Willoughby return. Plus, of course, Prince Harry, the court case. Lots of repercussions. It's not just the Daily Mirror on trial, it's Prince Harry's reputation too. So Lady Colin Campbell is going to be here on that tonight.
Yeah, well, the last royal to go into the witness box didn't necessarily cover himself in glory, so that'll be fascinating stuff, Dan. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. No doubt the weather's going to show beautiful weather in Somerset, as it always does, particularly after the victory we had at the cricket against Essex in the 2020 yesterday. Glorious sunshine there, but some cloud elsewhere. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this has been State of the Nation.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Cloud becomes widespread once again overnight. Clearest skies will remain in the west, and then that will lead to sunny spells again becoming widespread during the day on Tuesday. But high pressure remains in control of our weather. That's why it's settled It's mostly dry, but there is a thickening of the low cloud through the evening, and overnight we'll see that cloud creep westwards. It'll be thick enough in 1 or 2 spots to give some drizzle, most likely East Midlands, parts of the east coast, but otherwise it's a dry and settled night for many, albeit increasingly cloudy. Clearest spells towards western areas, perhaps the odd mist patch for Northern Ireland as we wake up on Tuesday, but they will quickly disappear. And then the sunny skies in the west will nibble away at the fringes of the cloud, and so that cloud will progressively ebb back towards the North Sea coast. I think it will remain across parts of central and eastern Scotland, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk. Here, temperatures 12, 13 Celsius at best, but where we've got the warm, sunny spells further west, Wales and the southwest, 22 Celsius likely. Tuesday evening, then, the cloud returns and it pushes westwards through the evening and overnight. Again, clearest skies remaining towards Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, Northwest England, West Wales, Cornwall, for example, and temperatures dipping into the single figures in places. A cool start then on Wednesday, and once more, a largely cloudy start for many. That low cloud will take its time through the morning, but it will eventually push back towards the east. And although it seems unfair to have the same repeating weather pattern if you're in the east, I'm afraid we've got a few more days of it. A lot of low cloud remaining here and suppressed temperatures. Humidity rises on Thursday and Friday. Higher temperatures, but a risk of showers as well.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to